Hello, I'm Jeannine Vegh, and I'm an independently licensed marriage and family therapist in the Columbus, Ohio area. I specialize in working with survivors of narcissistic abuse. I also write about this on my blog, discerninggal.com, and I teach a course on Udemy called Surviving the Narcissist.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Miller. I am a therapist in Westerville, Ohio. I also work with individuals who have been involved with a narcissist or victims of narcissistic abuse, but I also work with narcissists themselves.
We are bringing this video series to you about narcissism to educate and enlighten you and open your eyes to something different that you won't find anywhere else. Underneath our blogs, our videos, you will find information on how to find us on the internet. Okay, so in episode 3, we're going to be talking about being raised by a narcissistic parent and growing up with them. And so let's start by talking about losing your sense of self with a narcissistic parent.
Okay, losing your sense of self and really developing your sense of self based upon their image of you, what they'd like you to be.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to dive into that. I mean, I tell me about your clients who you've counseled that have narcissistic parents.
Well, what happens is at an early age, you learn to put your needs aside for the parent, and you learn to become the caretaker of the parent's emotions. And so what's happening is you as a person are taking a back seat. So like what you were talking about, your parent is sort of pushing you into who they want you to be. And so, for example, lots of parents are going to help their children at a very young age to pick a dance class or to pick a sport or something. Like, well, don't you think this would be a better sport for you? Or don't you think you'd rather be in this dance class? I mean, we're all guilty of doing that. But what's different is the narcissistic parent is simply going to say, well, you're going to take tap classes and your sister's going to take ballet. And then you're not really getting a chance to decipher, do I want to be a tap dancer or would I rather be a ballet dancer? And let's say you go to your parent and you say, but I'd actually like to be a ballet dancer. I think I would be better at that. Well, we've already got you in this class. This is what you're going to do. It's because they've already got it set up in their minds, this image that they have of you, that they want you to take on this role. Maybe that's something they've always wanted to do, was to be a tap dancer, so they got you in that class. And maybe even in their fantasy world, they're idealizing you as them, and so they're kind of trying to play out or live vicariously through you.
So what I'm hearing that I think is important that you're saying, Jeannine, if I'm hearing you correctly, the narcissistic parent is parenting from their narcissistic wound rather than seeing their child as an individual.
Right?
To develop their own sense of who they are, differentiated from the parent.
Exactly.
The parent needs to see the child in a certain way, usually to validate the parent as a parent. So if they have a successful child, or if they have a child that is participating in a sport that they want, that reflects upon the narcissistic parent in the way that they are seeking. It's about their own validation. So it's really not even about providing for the child an experience that's going to help them grow and develop.
Exactly.
It's about...
as an individual.
Correct.
Grow and develop in understanding who they are as an individual.
And so the child growing up with a narcissistic parent really will struggle, not to their knowledge, they won't realize but they will not realize that they are developing in accordance to the experiences that the parent wants them to have, and the enmeshment that the narcissistic parent will often have, which is part of what develops the huge sense of responsibility that a child of a narcissist feels for that parent.
Right. And they also won't realize that they are not gathering insight on who they are as a person. And so by the time, because they're doing exactly what their parent has wanted them to do, so they're assuming that must be what I want. And a lot of times what I find with, because I work with adults, not with the children, is that when the adults come to me, they're saying, I don't even know who I am. I don't know what career path I want to take now that I have this ability to choose. I don't know what I like or what I want. And so that's what you see a lot of times, because they've grown up here, kind of thinking to themselves, well, mom wants me to do it this way, or dad wants me to do it this way. And then when they become an adult, they're still thinking to themselves, well, I'm supposed to think this way politically because that's what mom said we think. Or I'm going to this particular faith because that's what dad said we are. And so what I'm teaching them, which we'll say a little bit later, is to differentiate from parents and begin to learn about themselves and decide, what do they want, what do they like, or what do they believe.
So for the children that grew up with narcissistic parents that were able to assert themselves at an earlier age, I mean, often you will have, or at an early age, what you often will have the child that becomes compliant, right? Which is what the narcissistic parent wants. Or you'll have the child that becomes, in the narcissist's eyes, defiant. And the defiant child, really in just trying to assert their independence, which is what children are supposed to do, learn about themselves, have a separate personality than their parents, all right? So I'm not saying these are people that are actually being defiant, but it will be perceived by the narcissist as being defiant. A lot of adult children who have had those experiences have felt complete rejection from their narcissistic parent.
And I'll tell you when it begins. When we're in the concrete operation stage of elementary school and on into middle school sometimes, we are adoring our parent. We are looking up to them because we don't know anything else. They're our parent. Whatever they say is God. We're going to marry them someday. And so the narcissist is thriving. Oh my God, yeah. They are becoming godlike. And they have all this power. But as soon as we become teenagers, that's when I find, and I'm sure you do as well, that my adult clients will tell me that that's when things begin to flip. Because when you do become a teenager, that's when you get into the big word, hypothetico-deductive reasoning. When you begin to think in the abstract as a person, you begin to look outside of yourself and look at the bigger picture, and that's when you begin to question things. That's the reason why we don't diagnose personality disorders in teenagers or in children, period, because they're going through an identity crisis in their teen years anyway, and so they all look like they have a personality disorder. But this is when they're talking back to their parent. And of course, many of us remember the generation with the backhand in the car, or the backhand in the front of the car. Or of course, you learn to sit in the back as far away from your parent as you can, so that hand can't reach back there so far. But anyways, this is when we begin to confuse the parent, the narcissistic parent, and that's when the defiance does set in. Or you have a child like, often you have the placator, which is going to do whatever it takes to keep the peace. Sometimes the spouse will do the same thing, placate the parent, just to keep everything nice and even in the household.
I appreciate the formal clinical data you provided. Even younger than what you're describing, I have seen with narcissistic parents, the way they treat some of their younger children, just when they become even independent in being able to choose what food they want, have what they like, have what they don't like, right? I forget what stage that is, excuse me, in development, and I'll have to go back and look at my book, and it becomes personal to the narcissist, right? It's a personal affront, which is very confusing for the child.
And they might even say, what do you mean you don't like it? I like it.
Exactly. Or it's, I made this for you. You're not going to eat what I've made for you. So then they get their first dose maybe of what it's like to be guilted, right? What it's like to be shamed for having a personal preference, which is a very strong manipulative tactic of a narcissistic parent.
Yeah.
Guilt and shame. They are superpowers, I think I'd like to say. And that can start very early from when kids start to have their own voice.
Right, exactly. Absolutely. What I was, just to distinguish what I was talking about, is when you become more of a teenager, you're starting to fight back. Whereas as a child, you're not necessarily going to fight back. You're going to just say, you might, cry and say, but I don't like it. And then, you're either going to sit there until you eat it, or you're going to go to your room and not have dinner. And that's that. But when you're a teenager, you do tend to be a little bit more of a fighter, I think. Because you're starting, some teenagers are starting to want to hold their ground. They're starting to want to fight for what they want.
Well, they should. It's a major developmental stage. Being able to assert themselves and fight, as you say, to fight for what they want and for their opinion. It's a very important developmental stage that a narcissistic parent will often try to squelch.
And also, the teenager has lots of peers around them that are also supporting them now and giving their opinions and saying, oh, well, you shouldn't listen to your parent. And, and so they're feeling that they need to keep up with that peer pressure. So they've got that backing them, which they don't necessarily have as children, because as children, you're probably going to hear, well, my mom says I have to do this, so that's what I do. And then you have that kind of, it's not really pressure, it's other than to do what your mom says, because that's what I do. My mom says that,
So I think we should talk about what we see now in our offices with regard to adult children of narcissists, right? So they've grown up, they've become adults, maybe are in their own relationships or marriages, but there are effects that last a lifetime unless you learn about it and challenge it.
Yeah.
And I don't mean challenge the narcissist per se, but challenge the belief system that you formed about yourself because you were raised by a narcissist.
Yeah. So you've grown up, we've talked a little bit about losing your sense of self. You've also probably not had any sense of boundaries. And you often the survivor will fall into the trap of being in a partnership with a narcissist. And generally, I find that out when they're telling me about their narcissistic partner who they've read about online. And then I will do a family history and begin to find out about their parents, and then learn what they were taught growing up by that parent, and then realize, well, do you see a correlation here between your mom or your dad and the partner that you're with now? And so that's what I see. Do you see?
Oh, absolutely. I see that all the time. And people will ask me, I assume they ask you, what is wrong with me? Why do I keep choosing narcissists?
Yes.
And I always tell people the same thing. Number one, I don't think anybody sets out to find a narcissist, right? nor do I believe that we necessarily attract narcissists, and we can talk more about that. We gravitate naturally to what feels normal.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes.
We gravitate naturally to what feels normal. And feelings, we may be aware of them, but a lot of them we're not aware of. They lie deep inside of us, okay? And so we have an interaction where someone else may be watching and hearing things. If they weren't raised by a narcissist, and they think, well, that doesn't sound good, or that's not healthy, or what have you. But to us, even intellectually, we might think, that sounded really selfish what they just said. But what we tend to go to, if we've been raised by narcissists, is we tend to go to the problem solving or the adaptation forms that we take to work through it with the narcissist, rather than having a hard stop for ourselves, saying, wait a minute, this is a violation of me.
Yeah.
Right? Because you weren't allowed to have any boundaries, like you said.
And you might also say to yourself, well, I tend to be that way too. Or, yeah, maybe I'm being a little too critical of them, and maybe I shouldn't be. Because that's what you learn at a young age, is you learn to question yourself. And so even when you're meeting a potential suitor, you're questioning yourself again. So what you're saying, that we look for things that are comfortable to us, it's not that we are consciously seeing those things. On some unconscious level, we're reverting or regressing back into childhood, and our unconscious mind is associating with this person that is comfortable for us.
We know what to do.
Yeah.
We know what to do with this.
I can handle this.
Yeah, we know what to do with this. Those conversations that feel like you're going every which way but straightforward, right? The complicated conversations. So I do see that. I see that a lot. What I also see with adults who have been raised by narcissistic parents, who are just coming to terms or just coming to the point of realization that there was something not right about the way they were raised, I see tremendous guilt for feeling how they feel about their parent. It's like they're doing something wrong.
Especially if it's from a religious perspective, honor thy father and thy mother. That's what I hear a lot of times. Well, I don't want to, especially in terms of differentiation. And one of the exercises I do is have them write a goodbye letter to their parent that I got from Dr. Lisa Firestone. And they'll say, but I don't feel right just saying goodbye to my parent. So I have to go into an explanation of them that you're not saying goodbye to them as a person, but as a parent. You no longer need them to be there for you at your beck and call. You have to be a grown-up now. You have to make decisions on your own, and you have to teach this to your parent. It's okay, I've got this. And sometimes it can be very difficult. I've had a couple people that just said, I can't do this. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. Because, you have to do an exercise when you feel ready to it. Another person isn't able to do it because she's still living at home. She's a very young adult and had to go back home for college. And she rightly said, I don't think I'm going to be able to do this until I leave the house and I'm actually living on my own. And I said, yeah, I think that makes sense. So that is very important, that differentiation process. I also want to bring up the different types of sibling sets in the household, the different types of siblings, the roles that they play in the household. What Elizabeth and I are referring to mostly is the scapegoated child. And I don't know, I found that the scapegoated child is generally the same sex as the narcissist. So I found that it's women with mothers and men with fathers. And then I find that the hero, the one who gets hero worshipped in the sibling set, is the opposite sex. So mothers are going to revere their sons as being the gods, and fathers will revere their daughters, not necessarily as goddesses, but more their best friend, or their confidant. And that can sometimes take on an even more extreme role, to sexual abuse, is what I mean. But that's not always what's going to happen. It's just an extreme situation that I've seen in some circumstances. Sorry, I don't want to keep saying the same thing. So hero worship, then you've got the placater, which I've already mentioned, and that's the person trying to keep the peace in the home. Once in a while, I have worked with the placater. Usually I'm working with the scapegoat. I don't think I've ever worked with the one who was hero worshipped. How about you?
Well, I probably have. No one is coming to mind right now, but full disclosure, I was raised by a narcissistic mother, and we very much fell into those roles. I would be the scapegoat. My brother would be the hero, if you will. And as adults, my brother and I are able to discuss between us so that it doesn't impact our relationship, being raised by a narcissistic mother who is still alive, and the impact on us, and being able to take care of our relationship, so that we don't create any kind of barrier between us or triangulate at all with her. I have not worked, this I think is more your area of expertise, working with the sibling sets and from that perspective. I've worked more with individuals and not worked from a perspective of where they fall necessarily in the birth order with a narcissistic parent. So I would defer to you on that. So let me ask you this. What might a scapegoat hear from their narcissistic parent?
Well, the scapegoat is going to take on all the blame. And everything's going to be their fault. The parent is never going to take responsibility for anything, or ever going to say they're sorry. And that's something we brought up in our introduction to narcissism and talking about the partner more, is that that same type of attitude, not saying they're sorry or taking responsibility. Another thing that I notice is holding other children in high esteem, not necessarily in the household, but other children outside of the household. So there might be a child that you are compared to when you're growing up. Well, how come you're not as smart as she is? Or how come you're not as good of a dancer as she is? Or you're not as good in gymnastics or cheerleading or what have you? So that one I think can really be disheartening for a child who's raised with a narcissistic parent, because you're never good enough. And that's the name of the book by Dr. she's not a doctor, but Carol McBride, is When Will I Be Good Enough for Daughters of Narcissistic Mothers. Yeah.
Every woman raised by a narcissistic mother needs to read this book.
Definitely.
When will I ever be good enough?
Yeah.
Yes. And you will see all sorts of iterations of narcissistic mothers in that book and relationships. And I think that's important to say. I mean, we talked about this in earlier videos. There is no one size fits all. The presentations can be very different. If we look at a covert narcissistic parent versus an overt narcissistic parent, you might have two children from those two parents would be have a very different experience.
Yes.
Nonetheless, still traumatic, still experiencing tremendous manipulation, and still affecting their ability to develop their own sense of self.
Exactly. Yeah, and I like to use the term martyr. That's what I see a lot with survivors of narcissistic parents, is the parents that they were raised with. Oh, woe is me. Oh, you don't like what I made for you. I must not be a good cook. Or the parent who, what I find a lot is a parent who is loved and admired by so many people outside of the family circle, because the people outside of the family circle, they're not looking at your parent as a narcissist because they have their own parents to love them and nurture them. So they're not able to empathize with the child. And so when you're trying to turn to those adult people that are around your family and you're trying to explain to them things, or you're needing help from them or assistance, they just don't understand. How could you possibly say that about your parent? They are a saint. I mean, they do all this stuff for the church. They do all this stuff for the PTA. They do all this stuff. They're the brownie leader, the Girl Scout mother, the den mother, what have you. So people around you, and that's what further isolates the children, is because they have no one to talk to. Maybe to their teacher. But, you know, when we were growing up, even going to the teacher, they're not going to necessarily empathize with us when we were growing up. They were more going to be, well, you have to respect your parent, and your parent must know best. And so you really had no one that you can talk to. In this day and age, I think teachers, because now they understand the concept of mandated reporting, and so do doctors and so forth, they're going to listen to children a little bit more. So if you're a young person listening to this, don't hesitate to reach out to the adults in your community, because we are in a more modern mindset.
Yes, with regard to maybe more dangerous situations. The sad thing for children is that not a teacher or a doctor or whoever is going to be less likely to validate feelings of a child that says, my mother or father only think of themselves, right? I mean, it's such a different experience. I mean, we're talking about narcissistic abuse, and yes, there's a hard line there. So I think as a young person, just the sense of not being able to make a connection, or knowing that they are not being heard or understood, or if they're trying to tell their parent something and the parent ends up talking about how what they're saying makes them feel. Like if a child's saying, you know, this happened and this happened and this happened, you know, like I didn't do well on this test and I'm upset, and the narcissistic parent could say, well, I helped you study, it's not my fault. I mean,
exactly,
right? That's how it would come across. Are you saying that we didn't work hard enough on your project because I stayed up all night with you? I mean, all night with you. I don't anything to it will impact the narcissistic parent in a way that says, what is this saying about me? What I tell young people, I no longer work with adolescents, but when I did, it's really difficult. You're in a tough spot, and this could be another topic sometime, to say to a teenager, well, you have a narcissistic parent.
Yeah.
Actually, I don't think I ever really said that, but what I would, because
they would go home and maybe say that to their parent when they get pissed off at them.
And it would put the child at greater risk of being criticized or hurt by the parent. But I would explain to them how to focus on self-soothing, being able to take care of themselves, being able to talk to people that they feel like can meet them at their feelings, whether it's a teacher or a friend or even a parent of one of their friends can also be helpful. So that's a different subject, but
so we're kind of getting to the end, and I want to make sure to talk about some things that people can do to elaborate on some things that survivors of narcissists can do to work on this on themselves. And obviously going to see a therapist, is very important. And I think you pointed out in another video, it doesn't matter. It's ideal if the person specializes in working with survivors of narcissists, but going to see a therapist, period, can be very helpful in getting you started on your journey. But what you want to work on is learning to develop a sense of self, learning to build boundaries for yourself, learning to differentiate from your parent, and you want to take some workshops, or Dr. Lisa Firestone does have some workshops online about attachment styles. And there's also a book out, I think it's called Attachment, that many people have talked to me about. You can read about attachment styles online. I always caution people to only read things that are written by people in the psychology field, or something that's written by, say, psychologytoday.com, not from a blogger. And you also want to learn about understanding the narcissistic partner so that you don't end up in a relationship with them, because that's so easy to happen when you've grown up with a narcissistic parent, as we've already mentioned.
Yes.
So,
absolutely.
What would you like to add to that?
I think that list was great. I encourage people, just as Jeannine did, to seek out someone like Jeannine or myself to help in this journey. It's very confusing. It's very confusing to understand how you were raised and why it feels so bad. Your relationship with your parent feels so bad, or felt so bad, and why potentially as an adult you can't seem to relate to your parent. Why you feel upset after you have conversations. Often that's a good sign that you're dealing with someone with a personality disorder. You come away from conversations feeling confused, feeling blamed, feeling responsible. Did I do something wrong? How did I disappoint them? So that's enough to take you, like Jeannine said, just to a therapist in general to get the process started. I think people need to understand too, this is a journey. It takes time to understand it. And it's a journey that I would recommend you do on your own first, without going to your parent and saying, I believe you're a narcissist, and trying to talk that through with them, because they will double down on their behavior and tell you that they did a great job raising you and you're ungrateful. So with that said, I think we've touched upon a lot and have given everyone hopefully a lot to think about.
Yes. So in episode 4, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to look at a film by George Cukor from 1944 called Gaslight. And we're going to discuss this when 2 therapists go to the movies. So thank you for joining us here today.
Yes, thank you very much.